Welcome back, everyone, to Sip and Talk. Go ahead, settle in, maybe grab your drink.
Hope you got something good.
Because today, we're getting into some really tangled, dramatic stuff, some pretty wild geopolitical ideas, actually.
Yeah, the title alone kind of grabs you, doesn't it? Temptation. But don't worry, we're talking strategic temptations here. The kind big countries might face when things get, well, shaken up globally.
Exactly. Nothing supernatural, promise. It's more about exploring these huge, maybe risky choices that could be out there. Yeah. You know, what happens when weakness meets opportunity? And what stories do nations tell themselves or their people to justify potentially massive, world-changing moves?
Right. And we're going to unpack all this based on some really fascinating information we've been looking through together. We'll start with a check-in on the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Yeah, you really have to start there, don't you? It's so central to everything right now.
Absolutely. Then we'll take a big step back, way back, actually. Centuries.
Ooh, history lesson time.
Kind of. Looking at how Russia got hold of just a vast amount of territory from China over time. Through treaties, mostly.
Okay, that sounds like important background.
It's really crucial context for some of the ideas we'll get into later.
Gotcha.
And speaking of later ideas, we'll then pivot to a huge challenge facing China today. The immense difficulty and the potential fallout of any military action against Taiwan.
Right. Why is that considered so risky, like potentially devastating for Beijing itself?
Exactly. And that leads us to the most thought-provoking bit, the Satan's temptation itself.
Okay, here we go.
We'll explore this hypothetical scenario that's presented, an alternative path for China, one that might look, maybe on the surface, more economical or practical than Taiwan.
But there's a catch, right? A big if.
A huge if. It only works if Russia were severely weakened, like collapsing weak.
Wow, okay. And we'll look at the stories, the narratives that might be used to sell that kind of move.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thought experiment designed to make a point. So our job today is just to guide you through this information.
Right. We'll look at the facts, the analysis, these hypotheticals.
And just help you navigate these pretty complex, sometimes sensitive topics based purely on what we've been reading.
Yep. No taking sides here. We're just presenting the ideas and the context behind them. Sounds like a pretty heavy brew today.
It is, but an important one.
Okay, let's fill up our cups then. Metaphorically, of course. Or literally, if you have one. Let's jump in.
Ready when you are.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the Russia-Ukraine war. Where do things stand right now? Because the latest stuff we've seen gives this feeling, I don't know, like Ukraine is really pushing back, not just holding the line.
That's definitely the picture emerging. It looks like less of a purely defensive stance in many areas and more. Well, actively challenging Russian forces, even inside Russia itself.
Wait. Inside Russia? Like across the border, that feels like a big shift.
It is significant. There was this example from August 2024. Reports suggesting Ukraine had gained control of something like 1,000 square kilometers inside Russia.
1,000 square kilometers
Right.
in Russia?
Yeah, specifically in the Kursk region.
Wow. That's not just a little raid then. That's actually holding territory.
Exactly. And the analysis suggests this might be the biggest land action Ukraine's taken inside Russia since, the full invasion started in 2022.
So what's the strategy there? Why do that?
Well, the thinking seems to be about stretching Russia thin, pulling their troops, their resources, away from the main fronts further south.
Make them defend their own turf.
Right. And maybe impact morale, create some pressure inside Russia itself. It's like taking the fight into the opponent's corner.
Makes sense. Force them to divert resources they need elsewhere. Change the game board a bit.
Precisely. Changing the battlefield geometry. Making Russia defend places they thought were safe.
Okay. And it's not just inside Russia, right? We've also seen stuff about massive strikes in the occupied areas within Ukraine.
Oh, yeah. Around June of this year, for instance, reports of these really extensive, large-scale strikes, places like the parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson that Russia holds.
What kind of targets? What was the impact?
Apparently, they hit and destroyed dozens of Russian military bases, major ammo dumps, even critical infrastructure, power stations.
Power stations, wow.
Yeah, leading to widespread blackouts in those occupied regions. The scale is highlighted, too, one of the largest attacks like this on occupied zones since 2022.
So Ukraine's showing they can really reach deep behind enemy lines and cause serious disruption.
It seems so.
Yeah.
Hitting ammo and bases is obvious military logic, but hitting power stations, That feels like trying to make life really difficult for the occupiers, degrading their whole operating environment.
Yeah, literally turning the lights off on them, making it harder to communicate, operate, everything.
It goes beyond just hitting frontline targets.
And it gets even more strategic than that, right? There were mentions of attacks on really key military sites inside Russia proper.
That's right, that same time frame, June 2025. Reports of nighttime attacks hitting facilities involved with Russia's most strategic stuff.
Like what?
Well, one near Moscow, reportedly linked to making intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs.
Whoa, ICBM.
And another was an Arctic base for their nuclear submarines.
Nuclear subs and ICBMs. That's hitting the absolute top tier of their military power, isn't it?
It certainly seems aimed that way. It connects to that whole nuclear triad concept, land, sea, air delivery.
Right, right.
So attacking facilities linked to those.
Yeah.
Well, the analysis suggests it's a strategic move, trying to potentially degrade Russia's core nuclear capability.
That is playing a very high-stakes game.
Wow. Extremely high stakes.
And President Zelensky has been pretty open about this stuff.
Seems so. The reporting includes him talking about Ukraine's ability to conduct extensive and thorough strikes against Russian territory and assets.
So, not hiding it.
No. And he's also framed it as, indirectly protecting wider European security. The idea being, if Ukraine keeps Russia busy and weakens them, they're less able to threaten others in Europe.
Like keeping the bully tied up so they can't bother the neighbors? Makes sense.
That seems to be part of the message. He's also apparently warned European nations to watch out for potential Russian military moves within Belarus.
Okay, so summing up Ukraine's side from what we're seeing. Tactical flexibility, taking the fight into Russia, hitting deep, significant targets, showing they can punch hard on multiple fronts.
That's the picture of their approach presented here. Now, flipping it around, looking at Russia's side, the information suggests they're facing some pretty serious difficulties.
Okay, what kind of challenges?
Well, remember that Kursk setback, where Ukraine took ground inside Russia?
Yeah.
The analysis indicates that really caught Russia off guard. And maybe more importantly, it apparently led to reports of internal blaming, finger-pointing within the Russian military command.
Oh, really? Like, hey, whose fault was this? That doesn't sound good for cohesion.
No. It could point to issues with their command structure, maybe bad intelligence, or just a lack of coordination. Problems defending their own border. It suggests friction, maybe some disarray.
Okay, so they were surprised, maybe started blaming each other. Did they hit back hard? Did they retaliate?
Oh, definitely. The material notes some major retaliatory strikes. For example, June 10th, 2025, Russia launched this massive air raid against Ukraine.
How massive are we talking?
The numbers cited are pretty staggering. 1,451 drones and 78 missiles.
1,400 drones in one go. That's insane.
It's highlighted as one of the largest single air attacks they've launched since the war began.
Wow. What was their justification? What did they say it was for?
They apparently claimed it was a response, mentioning something called a spider web operation and bridge explosions. Ukraine reported intercepting a lot of it.
As they usually do.
Right. But given the sheer volume, they acknowledged there were still huge losses and impacts. So it shows Russia still has that capability for massive strikes, even if defenses are improving.
Yeah, it's like throwing 1,000 rocks at a window. Some are going to get through no matter how strong the glass is. What else is Russia dealing with?
There are mentions of issues around prisoners of war, things like delayed exchanges, and also some, frankly, disturbing allegations. Allegations about Russian medical personnel potentially being involved in putting humiliating markings on captured Ukrainian soldiers.
Humiliating markings? What does that mean? Like branding? That sounds awful.
The specifics aren't detailed, but the implication is something intended to demean or mark the POWs, if that's happening. Well, the analysis suggests it could point to serious discipline problems, morale issues, maybe even war crimes within parts of the Russian military.
Yeah, that's really dark.
It is. And then beyond the battlefield stuff, there's the ongoing pressure from Western sanctions. Huge economic and strategic pressure.
Right, they keep piling on.
The UK, for example, announced its biggest package of sanctions yet back in February 2025.
And the goal of sanctions is basically to starve their war machine, right? Cut off the money and tech.
Pretty much. Cripple the economy, limit access to finance, technology, export markets, make it harder and more expensive to fund the war effort, so that economic pressure directly hits their ability to fight.
Okay, so let's wrap this part up. Based on what we've seen, Ukraine seems adaptive, proactive, pushing into Russia, hitting key targets, showing growing capabilities. On the other side, Russia's facing setbacks like Kursk, possible command issues, launching huge retaliatory strikes but at great cost, dealing with grim allegations about POWs, and feeling the squeeze from sanctions.
That's the snapshot. A really dynamic conflict. Ukraine challenging Russia hard, Russia struggling with losses and internal pressures.
Fascinating stuff. Heavy, but fascinating. Okay, let's shift gears now. This next part feels completely different, but it's actually super relevant for thinking about these big strategic choices later on.
The history lesson part.
Yeah. This is where it gets really interesting, I think. We're going back in time, looking at the long, sometimes messy history between Russia and the Soviet Union and China, specifically how Russia ended up with huge amounts of territory that used to be China's.
Yeah, understanding this history is vital context for that Satan's temptation idea later. Because Russia, starting way back in the 17th century, basically expanded eastward.
Right. Across Siberia.
Exactly. And inevitably, they started interacting with, and often pushing into, Chinese territory under the Qing dynasty and later the Republic of China. And they did this through exploration, military presence, but really critically, through a series of treaties.
So it wasn't just one big grab. It was step by step over a long time.
A gradual process, yeah. Often taking advantage of times when China was weak, dealing with internal rebellions or fighting other foreign powers.
Okay, and how much land are we talking about? Is it like a few border towns changing hands?
Oh, no, it's enormous. The scale is just massive. The analysis breaks it down into several major regions.
Okay, let's map that out. What were the big pieces?
First, there's the outer northeast. This is that huge chunk of land north of the Heilongjiang River, or Amur River, and east of the Ussuri River.
How big is that?
We're talking roughly 1 million square kilometers.
1 million square kilometers. That's, I mean, that's bigger than France and Spain put together, isn't it?
About that, yeah.
Yeah.
And it includes really crucial places, like Vladivostok.
Russia's main Pacific port, right?
Exactly. Also Sakhalin Island, tons of oil and gas there, and the fertile lands known as the 64 villages east of the river, cities like Blagoveshchensk.
Okay, so valuable resources, farmland, and a super strategic port. What else?
And you got the outer northwest. This is territory taken from what was then Xinjiang and parts of Central Asia. That's another roughly 610,000 square kilometers.
Where's that more specifically?
Areas south of Lake Balkhash, parts of Ili, Tarbagatai, Altai regions, and also the region called Tanu-Irangkai.
Which is now?
The Tuva Republic inside Russia.
Okay. And resources there. Minerals, maybe?
Yep. Significant mineral wealth mentioned. Gold, tungsten, uranium in Tuva, coal, other non-ferrous metals in the Ili area, plus access to water from Lake Balkhash.
Minerals, water. Got it. Next big piece.
Outer Mongolia. Now, this is the territory of modern-day independent Mongolia, about 1.56 million square kilometers.
Okay, wait. If it's independent Mongolia, how is that land lost from China to Russia?
Good question. It's nuanced. It wasn't directly annexed by Russia, but the analysis highlights that the Soviet Union played a decisive role in supporting Mongolia's independence from China back in the 1920s.
So they helped break it away.
Essentially. So from a certain Chinese historical perspective, it's viewed as a loss of control, a loss of territory heavily influenced, maybe even orchestrated, by Russia.
Okay, influenced away, not directly taken. That makes sense as a different kind of loss. Got it.
Right. There's also an area around Lake Baikal, south and southwest of the lake. About 100,000 square kilometers seeded earlier in the 18th century.
And Lake Baikal is famous for that insane amount of fresh water, right?
Exactly. It holds something like 20% of the world's unfrozen fresh surface water, plus forests, tourism potential, a huge asset.
Access to that much fresh water alone is strategically massive. Anything else?
One more area mentioned. West of the Khingan Mountains in the Argun River, roughly 250,000 square kilometers. Part of an early border settlement.
Okay, so if we add up the areas that Russia directly annexed, not counting Mongolia, what's the total figure?
The material points to commonly cited figures, like from Wikipedia, putting the total directly acquired area at around 1.54 million square kilometers.
1.4 million square kilometers. Let me try to picture that. That's bigger than India, right? Or like a sixth of the entire U.S. That is just staggering.
It's immense. The analysis does mention some sources cite even higher figures, like up to almost 6 million square kilometers if you include Outer Mongolia and maybe areas of indirect influence. But 1.54 million is the figure for direct annexation.
Okay, so even just the land Russia governs today that was historically China's, it's like a medium-sized continent, and you said these lands are packed with resources.
Absolutely. The analysis really stresses the strategic importance. That outer northeast, you've got oil, gas from Sakhalin, vital fisheries off the coast, timber, agriculture, and Vladivostok. Being ice-free is just a massive deal for their Pacific Fleet, trade projecting power year-round.
Yeah, an ice-free port in that part of the world. That's like having the only working door in winter. Huge advantage.
Exactly. Then the outer northwest minerals, gold, tungsten, uranium, coal, other metals, stuff crucial for industry, technology, and water access is increasingly key.
And even independent Mongolia, still resource-rich.
Packed with stuff, according to the analysis, world-class copper, coal, uranium deposits, plus huge grasslands for grazing.
And by call.
Just the sheer volume of fresh water is strategically unique, plus timber, tourism.
So Russia didn't just get empty land. They got energy, minerals, water, timber, food sources, and critical port access. A real treasure trove.
Totally. The analysis makes it clear these acquisitions were fundamental for Russia becoming a major energy and strategic power. Vladivostok is maybe the prime example of securing a vital gateway.
Okay, so how did Russia actually get these lands? You mentioned treaties. Were these fair negotiations?
Well, they're generally referred to as unequal treaties, at least from the Chinese perspective presented in the analysis.
Unequal treaties. Right. Why?
They were typically signed when China, under the Qing dynasty or the early republic, was really weak, dealing with massive internal rebellions, famines, or fighting wars with other foreign powers like Britain and France.
Ah, so Russia swooped in when China was down?
That's the pattern described. Let's quickly run through the main ones mentioned and why they're called unequal.
Okay.
Treaty of Nerchinsk, 1689, one of the earliest, ceded about 250,000 square kilometers. Even though China might have had a military edge then, the analysis says it was unequal because, well, they still lost land, and it didn't stop Russia from pushing further later.
Lost ground, even when relatively strong.
Okay. Then the treaties of Bura and Kyakhta in 1727, about 100,000 square kilometers around Baikal. Here, the analysis says Russia used diplomatic pressure when China was seen as weaker in the negotiations.
Diplomatic muscle during weakness? Got it. What about the 19th century? That's when things really heated up, right?
Oh, yeah. Big time. The Treaty of Agun, 1858, transferred about 600,000 square kilometers north of the Heilongjiang. The analysis calls this unequal because China was busy fighting the Second Opium War against Britain and France. Russia basically used the threat of force to get it signed. It's noted as one of the biggest single land losses via treaty.
Wow. Taking land by threatening force while China was already fighting someone else? Yeah, that sounds pretty unequal.
Right. And then right after that, the Treaty of Peking in 1860 ceded another 400,000 square kilometers east of the Ussuri. This included Vladivostok and those 64 villages.
How is that unequal?
Russia was totally opportunistic. British and French forces were literally attacking Beijing at the time. Russia just stepped in and mediated and got this huge territory as a reward, basically. No military cost to them at all.
Wait, so while China's capital was under attack, Russia just picked up Vladivostok and all that land without firing a shot?
That's the picture painted. Zero cost expansion.
Okay, yeah. Unequal feels like an understatement there.
It fits the description. Then Treaty of Tarbagatay, 1864. Another 440,000 kilometers south of Balkhash. Again, China was swamped with huge internal problems. The Taiping Rebellion, unrest in Xinjiang. Russia forced the agreement.
Another case of capitalizing on China's internal chaos. The pattern seems pretty clear.
It really does. There was also the Treaty of St. Petersburg in 1881 about the Ili region in Xinjiang. China actually managed to get some territory back through negotiation there.
Oh, okay. A slight win.
A partial recovery. But the analysis notes they still lost strategically important areas that Russia had occupied.
So still a net loss in key areas.
And we can't forget the Sino-Russian Secret Treaty of 1896. This didn't directly cede huge land chunks, but allowed Russia to build the Chinese Eastern Railway right across northeast China, Manchuria.
A railway? How is that unequal?
The analysis calls it unequal because it granted Russia massive railway rights and military privileges like stationing troops deep inside Chinese territory, all under the guise of a defensive alliance against Japan. It essentially gave Russia a military foothold and huge influence.
Ah, gaining control and access, framed as helping out. Sneaky.
Seems that way. The analysis also mentioned Soviet actions later supporting Outer Mongolia's independence in 1924, effectively annexing Tanu-Uriankai earlier, just further cementing the loss of areas China had historically claimed.
Okay, so this went on for centuries. Have these borders been properly settled more recently?
Yes. The analysis brings up boundary agreements signed between China and Russia in 1999 and 2004.
Okay, so they finally drew a line.
Pretty much. According to the material, these recent agreements are seen by some as China basically confirming it gives up claims to those territories, formalizing the borders set by those earlier, arguably unequal treaties. But it's noted this view isn't universally accepted, it's disputed.
Okay, so officially settled on paper now. But the history, the feeling of those unequal treaties might still linger for some people.
That perspective is definitely part of the historical context presented. The summary is, why did this happen? Primarily, Qing dynasty weakness, internal strife, external wars, then Soviet pressure later on.
China's internal problems were Russia's centuries-long opportunity.
That's a major takeaway from this history. The analysis even connects it to today, mentioning figures like Lot Ching-te in 2024, reportedly suggesting China could reclaim land now that Russia seems weakened by Ukraine.
Oh, really? People are actually saying that.
It's mentioned as a viewpoint. But the analysis immediately points out those 2001-2004 treaties where China officially agreed to the borders make that legally very complicated.
Yeah.
And currently, it seems unlikely given those formal agreements.
Right. So it's a huge historical loss, officially settled by modern treaties, but still a point of contention that simmers under the surface. Wow. That's some intense history between those two giants.
It really lays the groundwork for understanding potential strategic thinking, even if just hypothetically.
Okay. Deep breath. Switching gears completely now. But stay with us because this is where that history and today's strategic picture start to connect in a really fascinating way. We're going to talk about Taiwan. And this is a critical question. Why is attacking Taiwan seen as just so incredibly difficult and risky for China? The analysis we looked at makes a really powerful point here. It argues that failing to take Taiwan wouldn't just be a military loss.
No.
It could be a multiple fatal blow for the CCP regime itself.
That's the core argument presented. The stakes, according to this analysis, could not be higher for the Chinese Communist Party. Trying and failing to take Taiwan isn't just losing a war. It could trigger this cascade of catastrophic consequences, potentially threatening the regime's very survival.
Okay, multiple fatal blow. That's heavy stuff.
Right.
What are these different ways failure could be fatal for the CCP, according to this material?
The analysis breaks it down. Political, military, diplomatic, economic, and social impacts. It shows how failure ripples out way beyond just the battlefield.
Let's get into those.
Right.
Politically, how could failing be fatal?
It hits right at the CCP's legitimacy. The party has spent decades building this narrative that reunification with Taiwan is a core goal, non-negotiable, essential for national rejuvenation.
Right, they talk about it constantly.
And Xi Jinping himself has personally invested so much prestige in this, even saying the issue cannot wait generations.
So the party made this huge promise, and Xi tied his own leadership to it.
Exactly. So if they go all out, launch an invasion, and fail, that central promise, that core nationalist goal they've hyped for decades, suddenly looks impossible.
Yeah, that would be a huge letdown.
Devastating, the analysis suggests. A massive blow to internal nationalism. It could seriously damage the regime's legitimacy in the eyes of its own people. It's like the ultimate broken promise on a national scale.
It's not just failing a policy, it's failing a core reason they claim the right to rule. And for Xi personally, what are the risks?
Well, given his deep personal connection to the goal and all the effort poured into military modernization specifically for this, failure in Taiwan would directly undermine his political standing. Massively.
Could it lead to challenges to his rule?
The analysis suggests it could lead to significant internal pushback, maybe even increase the risk of a coup or serious challenges to his leadership.
Wow. So his leadership is directly on the line. Okay. What about the military and diplomatic fallout from failure?
If the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, tries to take Taiwan, which the analysis reminds us is geographically pretty small, only about 15th the size of Fujian province next door.
Right.
And they fail, it would just starkly expose the actual strength or weakness of their military.
Like pulling back the curtain and showing they're not the invincible giant they project.
Precisely. And the consequences of that exposure would be huge, both globally and at home, externally. Neighbors like Japan, Vietnam, India, countries already wary of China. They'd likely feel much less intimidated.
Right, they'd see the limits of China's power.
And existing international groups, alliances, G7, the QA, EAD, US, Japan, Australia, India, maybe even NATO. They could really solidify into what the analysis calls a persistent containment ring around China.
A containment ring? What does that mean practically?
Basically, a coordinated long-term effort by major powers to limit China's expansion, militarily, economically, politically. If the PLA is shown to be beatable, these countries will be much more willing and feel more able to work together to counter China's ambitions.
Okay, so failure makes neighbors bolder and rivals more united against them. What about inside China for the military itself?
Internally, the analysis suggests people would start questioning the massive amounts of money poured into military modernization if they couldn't even achieve this core goal. And the PLA's prestige, which is really high and important for the regime's image, that would be shattered.
Okay, massive political and military risks. What about the economic collapse and social unrest?
This is presented as another potentially fatal blow. The economy is key. The analysis states that over 70% of China's trade shipping goes through or near the Taiwan Strait.
70%? That's almost everything.
It's a vital artery. If that waterway gets blocked or becomes a war zone for any length of time, the analysis uses really strong language. It says it would effectively cut China's economic throat.
Wow. Cut China's economic throat, to strangle their ability to trade.
That's the idea. Combine that with the inevitable severe international sanctions that would follow an invasion, and the potential for massive capital flight, money rushing out of the country. The economic picture looks incredibly grim.
Yeah, and the semiconductor issue, Taiwan's role there.
Absolutely critical. Taiwan is the world's chip factory, basically, especially advanced chips. TSMC alone, over 50% of the global market share.
Yeah, everyone relies on them.
So attacking Taiwan wouldn't just disrupt things. The analysis says it would devastate the global economy, which would create immense pressure from literally every other country to stop the conflict.
Right.
Now.
If the chips stop flowing, the whole world's tech industry seizes up. That gets everyone's attention fast.
It sends shockwaves everywhere. The analysis also points out China doesn't have the kind of global financial cushion the US dollar provides. Fighting a long war, even just a few months, the analysis suggests, could rapidly burn through their foreign exchange reserves.
And that, plus trade disruption, plus sanctions, leads to what?
A high risk of catastrophic stagflation, that really dangerous mix of high inflation and economic stagnation. No growth, but rising prices.
That sounds like a recipe for major problems at home, which leads straight to social unrest, right?
It does. If a war means high casualties, especially among young men, remember the legacy of the one-child policy? Many are only sons.
Oh, right. That adds another layer.
If those sacrifices happen and there's no victory to show for it, the question, why did my son die, becomes incredibly powerful and dangerous for the regime.
That's such a painful human question.
The analysis suggests it risks sparking widespread public anger, protests, maybe a loss of social control. And think about this. The CCP spends enormous amounts of money on internal stability. Police, surveillance, censorship, the whole Wyman budget.
The Wyman Stability Maintenance budget. Yeah, it's huge.
If they're fighting a costly war and facing an economic crisis, the analysis suggests they might simply not be able to afford that massive internal security machine anymore. Local governments could go bankrupt, unable to pay police, maybe even local military units.
So the very tools they use to keep control could just run out of funding and fall apart. That's a direct path to potential regime collapse.
It's presented as a major vulnerability. Finally, there's this idea of a two-way opinion reversal, an internal awakening.
What does that mean?
If Taiwan, a thriving democracy, successfully resists an autocratic invasion, well, first, global opinion would overwhelmingly back Taiwan, highlighting that democracy versus autocracy narrative.
Yeah, that's a powerful story internationally. David versus Goliath, democracy versus autocracy.
But crucially, the analysis suggests that seeing a Chinese-speaking society successfully defend its democratic way of life could make citizens inside mainland China rethink their own system, potentially sparking demands for reform, maybe even resistance against the CCP.
So Taiwan's success could become a dangerous idea spreading within China itself.
That's the potential consequence highlighted.
Okay, let me try to sum this up. The analysis paints this picture where attempting and failing to take Taiwan could unleash a perfect storm for the CCP. Loss of political legitimacy, exposed military weakness leading to global containment, economic collapse, mass social unrest, and even the dangerous example of a successful democracy inspiring internal change. It's not just losing a battle, it's risking absolutely everything.
It frames the Taiwan issue as potentially existential for the current regime if they try and fail. Now, maybe we should quickly touch on just the purely military difficulties, beyond the strategic fallout of failure.
Right, just the basic mechanics of pulling off an invasion. How hard is it militarily?
The analysis points to several huge hurdles. First, geography. That Taiwan Strait, it's a serious barrier. About 180 kilometers wide, often rough seas, bad weather.
Not an easy boat ride?
Not at all. And critically, only about 10% of Taiwan's actual coastline is even suitable for a large-scale amphibious landing.
Only 10%, so they can't just land troops anywhere on the beach?
Nope. You need specific conditions. The right beach slope, seabed, enough space behind the beach for thousands of troops, and heavy gear to land and organize all at once under fire.
Right, it's not like landing on a tourist beach.
Definitely not. The analysis compares it to trying to run across a wide, choppy river while being shot at. Your forces are incredibly exposed and vulnerable during that crossing.
Okay, the crossing is a nightmare. What about once they land? The island itself?
Taiwan is very mountainous, especially the central and eastern parts. Peaks over 3,900 meters. That terrain massively favors the defender. Natural fortifications, cover, makes moving large armies really difficult. It's ideal for defensive tactics, maybe even guerrilla warfare inland.
So the island itself fights back, in a way. What about the cities, like Taipei?
Urban warfare, especially in the Taipei Basin. It's surrounded by mountains, limited entry points that are easy to defend or block. And once you're in a city, fighting street by street, building by building, it's notoriously slow, incredibly costly, and generates horrific casualties.
Yeah, we've seen that play out in other conflicts. Urban combat is just brutal.
Absolutely. Then there's just the sheer military complexity. An amphibious operation on this scale. The analysis estimates China might need to mobilize 1 to 2 million troops.
1 to 2 million?
And thousands of ships, including pressing civilian ferries and cargo ships into service just to move everyone and everything across the strait.
That scale? It's almost unimaginable in modern warfare. D-Day level stuff or bigger.
It's immense. And supplying that force across the water, the logistics are incredibly vulnerable to attack from Taiwan's defenses. Which brings us to Taiwan's porcupine strategy.
The porcupine strategy. Okay, what's that?
It's Taiwan's whole defense concept. Make yourself so prickly, so painful to attack that the cost just isn't worth it. Like a porcupine, maybe not huge, but covered in sharp quills.
Right. Don't try to hug the porcupine. Makes invasion incredibly painful. Got it.
Exactly. So Taiwan is investing heavily in asymmetric capabilities. Things that are cheaper, harder to find and destroy than big, expensive ships or planes.
Like what?
Shore-based anti-ship missiles, mobile missile launchers hidden in the mountains, lots and lots of drones. The analysis connects this directly to lessons from Ukraine.
Ah, how Ukraine used smaller, smarter tech to counter Russia's size.
Precisely. Showing how smaller forces with tech and willpower can really challenge a larger, more conventional military. And the analysis notes Taiwan's tech base is generally seen as higher than Ukraine's was.
So Ukraine provided the proof of concept, and Taiwan is building an even more advanced version of that prickly defense.
That's the parallel drawn. The analysis also points to potential shortcomings within the PLA itself. Despite all the modernization, they lack recent large-scale combat experience, especially compared to, say, the U.S. military. Their ability to conduct a massive, complex, joint operation like an amphibious invasion, it's completely untested in the real world.
So lots of fancy gear, but no real-world test drive on this scale.
And the analysis even mentions internal PLA reports expressing doubts about their own training, coordination, command structure, readiness for something this complex.
So even they have questions about whether they can actually pull it off under pressure. Interesting.
It's a perspective highlighted. Then there's the massive X factor, international intervention.
Right. Would the U.S. get involved?
Well, the U.S. has strategic ambiguity. They don't explicitly promise to intervene. But their support for Taiwan is clearly increasing. Big arms sales, like nearly $2 billion mentioned for 2025 alone.
So no blank check promise, but lots of weapons and support.
And the analysis concludes that if China did invade, the U.S. and key allies, especially Japan and Australia, would likely intervene. It probably wouldn't just be China versus Taiwan. It could quickly become China versus multiple major world powers.
And Japan and the Philippines are particularly key here.
Absolutely. Japan sees Taiwan's security as directly linked to its own. Taiwan is like a critical link in that first island chain, protecting Japan's southern flank. They've increased defense cooperation.
Okay.
And the Philippines.
Yeah.
Well, they have their own issues with China in the South China Sea. They're wary, and they could potentially provide crucial base access for U.S. forces if a conflict broke out.
So an invasion could mean fighting Taiwan, potentially the U.S., Japan, Australia, maybe U.S. forces operating out of the Philippines nearby. That just ramps up the difficulty exponentially.
It makes the military calculation incredibly complex and dangerous for China. The analysis also loops back to Ukraine lessons on the international front.
How so?
Any invasion of a sovereign place now triggers immediate global isolation, harsh sanctions, and likely a long, grinding war. China would probably face an even more unified and intense global backlash than Russia did.
Yeah, the world saw the playbook with Russia. They'd likely react even faster and stronger to China over Taiwan.
It's a very clear warning sign. There are also economic vulnerabilities to consider for both sides. Taiwan itself is vulnerable to a blockade. Limited energy reserves, maybe 6 months of oil, only 2 months of coal and gas.
So China could try to blockade them instead of invading? Starve them out.
It's a possible scenario. But the analysis notes, if China blockades the Taiwan Strait, it's one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. They'd also be severely disrupting their own trade, imports and exports.
Ah, right. They'd be cutting off their own economic lifeline, too.
Again, that global chip supply chain impact, TSMC. It's so huge, it gives almost every other country a powerful reason to pressure China or intervene to stop that economic catastrophe.
Right. Don't mess with the world's microchips. It gets everyone involved.
It certainly focuses global attention. So the expert consensus summarized in the material, it suggests a low short-term risk of invasion. The PLA isn't seen as confident enough yet, and the international situation, partly due to Ukraine lessons, is just really unfavorable for China right now.
Okay, low risk now. But is there a time frame where the risk might go up?
The year 2027 gets mentioned, possibly tied to PLA modernization milestones, maybe the 100th anniversary of the PLA, giving it symbolic weight for the CCP.
Okay, 2027 is a potential date to watch.
But a really critical point highlighted is this. If Taiwan can just hold out against an invasion for even 1 month.
Just 1 month.
That's seen as the crucial window. Enough time for international aid and intervention to really arrive and start making a significant difference.
So Taiwan just needs to survive that initial onslaught for a few weeks to potentially change the whole game.
That's the critical time frame cited for international help to become effective. The analysis also stresses the need for balance. Strong military deterrence to make invasion look too costly, but also political assurances to avoid miscalculations that could accidentally trigger a war.
Make invasion unthinkable, but also leave diplomatic doors open so nobody stumbles into conflict. A tricky tightrope.
Very tricky. So you put it all together, the immense military difficulty of the invasion itself, plus the potentially catastrophic political, economic, and social consequences of failure for the CCP regime. And it becomes really clear why attacking Taiwan is seen as such an incredibly high-risk, high-stakes gamble, according to this analysis.
Wow. Yeah, that really lays out just how monumental a challenge Taiwan is for China. It explains a lot about why, despite all the rhetoric, it hasn't happened.
It does paint a stark picture of the risks involved.
Okay. And that finally brings us to the last section, the most provocative part of this whole discussion, the Satan's temptation thought experiment. This is presented as an alternative strategic choice for China, an idea the analysis explores that might theoretically be more economical or practical than invading Taiwan.
But, and this is the crucial part.
Right, the giant asterisk.
It hinges entirely on one specific condition, a severely weakened, maybe even collapsing Russia.
Okay, so we have to imagine a hypothetical world where Russia is really, truly down and out, fragmented, chaotic.
That's the premise. Under that very specific condition, the thought experiment asks, could reclaiming historical lands from Russia, like that outer Manchuria, outer northeast region we talked about earlier, actually be a more viable, maybe even more strategically appealing option for China than the incredibly difficult and risky task of trying to take Taiwan?
Huh. So instead of going for the super hard target of Taiwan, what about going for that massive chunk of land Russia took historically if Russia was too weak to stop them?
Exactly. And the analysis lays out several arguments for why, in this specific hypothetical scenario of a collapsing Russia, attacking Russia for these historical lands might be viewed as more economical or simple compared to Taiwan. Again, this is following the internal logic of this thought experiment.
Okay, let's hear the arguments. Why might this hypothetical attack on a weak Russia seem easier or cheaper in that specific scenario?
Argument 1. The historical and legal narrative. The analysis argues that reclaiming outer Manchuria, land taken through those deeply resented, unequal treaties, offers much greater narrative space for internal legitimacy within China.
Narrative space, meaning it's an easier story to sell at home.
Precisely. It can be framed to the Chinese public as anti-imperialism, correcting historical injustice, getting back what was stolen during the century of humiliation.
Righting a historical wrong. That's a powerful nationalist message.
Compared to Taiwan, which is already a functioning democracy with its own identity. China has less clear historical or moral high ground for claiming reunification by force. The analysis suggests reclaiming lost land from a weakened, collapsing former imperial power, Russia, resonates more easily with nationalism than invading a democratic place that hasn't been ruled by Beijing in decades.
Okay, the domestic story for this hypothetical is potentially simpler, more resonant than the one for Taiwan. What about how the rest of the world might react?
Here, the analysis argues international intervention would be much harder to rally. If Russia's already collapsing, a Chinese move into the Russian Far East might be viewed by other powers, especially the West, through a colder lens of great power realism.
Great power realism, like, hey, strong countries take advantage of weak ones, that's just how it is.
Something closer to that, according to this hypothetical. Less likely to trigger the immediate intense sanctions and military intervention you'd expect over Taiwan. And crucially, the analysis points out, this land isn't NATO territory. It's not a democracy.
Right. No democratic ally being invaded.
Which makes it much harder for Western nations to generate the same level of emotional support or moral outrage that we saw for Ukraine or would expect for Taiwan.
So, less of an ideological fight, more just a pragmatic power shift in this hypothetical view.
That's the point made. Argument 2. Lower military risk and cost. The most obvious thing, it's a land border.
Right. No D-Day style invasion across the sea.
Exactly. No need for that incredibly complex, high-risk amphibious landing. No need to fight for air and sea control over a wide strait first. The analysis calls it fighting an inland war. Generally lower cost, potentially faster, much less logistically risky than a massive sea invasion.
Yeah, moving troops and supplies over land is vastly easier and less vulnerable than by sea.
And the terrain itself? The Russian Far East is often vast, open, extremely sparsely populated. Population density is mentioned as maybe 1 person per square kilometer. Russian military presence there is typically thin, more border guards than large combat formations.
Wide open spaces, hardly anyone there, not many soldiers.
And if, as the hypothetical assumes, Russia is already tied down and exhausted by Ukraine, potentially collapsing internally, the analysis argues they simply couldn't fight effectively on 2 major fronts. West against maybe NATO remnants or Ukraine, and East against China.
That makes basic strategic sense. You can't fight everyone everywhere when you're falling apart. But what about the ultimate fear factor? Nuclear weapons. Wouldn't Russia use them?
It's addressed. The argument presented is that, yes, Russia has nukes, but they'd likely be extremely reluctant to use strategic nukes, the city busters, over a border conflict in a sparsely populated region like Vladivostok, especially if they're already collapsing and internationally isolated.
Why not? It's still their territory being taken.
The idea in nuclear strategy is proportionality and escalation control. Using strategic nukes for a limited border fight, even a big one, risks triggering a full global nuclear exchange. That's suicide. The analysis suggests a collapsing Russian leadership would be focused on core survival and might deem using world-ending weapons for a border region disproportionate and far too risky, especially with no international support.
Okay, so the nuclear risk is always there, but maybe calculated as lower for this specific kind of conflict, in this specific collapse scenario.
That's the argument presented in this thought experiment. Argument 3, high economic return and resource strategy. Reclaiming the outer Northeast. That means immediately getting access to all those natural resources we talked about earlier.
Right, timber, oil, gas, minerals, water.
The analysis argues this would directly boost China's resource security. Reduce dependence on potentially unstable or distant suppliers for energy and raw materials.
Getting crucial stuff from right next door instead of shipping it across the world. Huge logistical and economic win.
Exactly. And getting Vladivostok is highlighted as a massive prize. It becomes a golden Pacific export port for Northeast China.
A warm water port right there.
Ice-free, strategic, reduces dependence on crowded southern ports like Shanghai or Guangzhou. Opens a whole new gateway for Pacific trade, maybe even naval projection.
Okay, a major port plus vital resources. Big economic incentives in this hypothetical.
Fourth, contrasting the international effects and risks versus Taiwan. Taiwan has that global democratic alliance backing it, the outer Northeast region. The analysis says it has no emotional support internationally.
Yeah, nobody in London or Washington feels a deep connection to the sovereignty of the Russian Far East in the same way they might feel about democratic Taiwan.
That's the implication. Attacking Taiwan challenges the whole democratic world order, invites a massive counter-reaction, reclaiming historical land from a collapsing Russia. The analysis suggests the West might view it more pragmatically, maybe as a regional power realignment, less likely to trigger the same moral outrage and unified intervention.
Seen more as cold geopolitics than an ideological battle.
Correct. And success here could actually boost China's internal rise narrative. Pulling this off, getting land and resources without a major world war, could be spun domestically as restoring imperial glory, fulfilling the China stands-up dream.
Unlike Taiwan, where failure could be catastrophic.
Exactly. The analysis contrasts it directly. Failure in Taiwan risks regime collapse. Success in this hypothetical Russia scenario could redirect internal frustration, maybe even strengthen the regime's legitimacy.
Like, hey, everyone, look at this shiny new land and port we got. Isn't that great? Don't worry about those other problems.
Potentially using success to shore up support, yes. Finally, the analysis highlights Russia's extreme weakness itself as the key window of opportunity. If Russia truly fragmented, internal coups, regional warlords popping up, the analysis suggests China could intervene under plausible pretexts. Stabilization, protecting Chinese diaspora in the region who were supposedly endangered by the chaos.
So not necessarily a formal war declaration on Russia, but going in under a different justification, like peacekeeping, almost.
That's the kind of approach suggested in the hypothetical. They could even support local proxy forces, maybe back a Far East provisional government that invites them in, formally avoiding a direct state-on-state war with whatever remains of the Russian Federation, especially if it's dissolving anyway.
That's a very pragmatic, if extremely cold-blooded, way to frame a potential land grab.
It's presented as a strategic option within this specific thought experiment framework. The analysis even includes a table comparing the hypothetical trade-offs side by side.
Taiwan versus Russia land.
Yeah. History narrative. Fragile for Taiwan versus strong for lost Russian land. International reaction. Intense versus weak observing. Military difficulty. Very high amphibious versus low inland. Cost risk. Huge prolonged versus small quick. Economic return. High risk versus direct resource board. And regime risk. Failure collapse versus success. Redirect internal frustration.
Wow, that table really spells out the hypothetical argument. Why, in this specific collapse scenario, the Russia target might look much more appealing purely from a cold strategic calculation perspective.
It frames the hypothetical choice strictly in terms of costs and benefit to the regime. The analysis also thinks about the narratives. If this hypothetical conflict happened, what stories would each side tell?
Right. How would they spin it?
China's narratives would likely pound on historical justice. Unequal treaties, century of humiliation, national rejuvenation linking it to the economy, resources, maybe Russia's betrayal if they needed a specific villain beyond just collapse. Geopolitical security framing it as stabilizing a chaotic border region.
And using social media.
Yeah, the analysis notes using platforms like X, nationalist comments, maybe referencing past figures who talked about reclaiming land, to frame it all as a righteous war.
Lots of appeals to history and national pride. What about Russia's side, even if they're collapsing? What's their narrative?
They'd likely focus on territorial integrity, national survival against aggression. Maybe frame it as anti-imperialism against Chinese expansionism. And crucially, they'd probably still try to play the nuclear deterrence card.
Warning about nukes, like they have in Ukraine.
Exactly, trying to make the cost too high for China. They might also push a Western conspiracy narrative, claim China was manipulated by the U.S., and use whatever state media remains to rally people against China's expansionist ambitions.
Fascinating. Even in hypothetical collapse, the same kinds of blame games and narratives emerge, both sides painting themselves as the victim or defender.
It really highlights how framing the conflict is a huge part of the conflict itself. The analysis also brings lessons from the actual Ukraine war back into this hypothetical.
How do Ukraine lessons apply here to this hypothetical Russia scenario?
Well, it notes Ukraine shows that even smaller or seemingly weaker forces can mount effective resistance, implying China could face unexpected guerrilla warfare even in sparsely populated Siberia.
Right. Don't underestimate local resistance.
Also, the isolation and economic pain Russia faced shows that sanctions hurt. China would face them too, maybe less intensely, depending on the global reaction in this hypothetical, but still significant. And as we keep saying, that nuclear risk, amplified by Russia's rhetoric in Ukraine, remains a massive, unpredictable barrier for China, even against a theoretically collapsing Russia.
So even if this hypothetical seems more economical or simpler than Taiwan in some ways, the risks, especially the nuclear one, are still enormous.
Absolutely. It's presented as a complex calculation, even within the realm of pure hypothesis.
Okay. This whole Satan's temptation thought experiment, it really is something. Makes you look at strategic choices completely differently. Let's quickly walk through the hypothetical 5 stages the analysis lays out for this scenario. It reads almost like a movie script.
Yeah, it's presented as this very specific step-by-step progression, even using the provocative phrase, peaceful unification of Vladivostok.
Peaceful unification of land taken by force. That sounds like a contradiction.
Right. That's part of the maybe ironic tone used in the analysis. It's describing how, in this very specific hypothetical of Russia's collapse, China might frame and execute the move, potentially with a story about locals welcoming them. Let's go through the stages.
Okay, stage 1, Russia on the brink.
This assumes Russia has hit rock bottom, exhausted by Ukraine, internal chaos, and critically, a total military vacuum in the Far East. Local officials in places like Vladivostok are depicted declaring they can't be governed by Moscow anymore, they need their own path.
So, complete breakdown of central control.
Yes, and in this hypothetical, China activates its network's United Front Work Ethnic Affairs to support local ethnic Chinese business leaders, other pro-China figures, maybe helps them form a Far East provisional government.
Finding sympathetic locals and propping them up to take charge.
That's the idea presented. The scenario imagines news reports showing demoralized Russian soldiers just walking away, and locals maybe even flying Chinese flags, just welcoming anyone who can provide stability and stop the chaos or starvation.
That's a very specific image of collapse and welcome. Okay, stage 2, China peacekeeping entry.
So China's military moves in. But the official story, according to the analysis, is peacekeeping and protecting Chinese residents who are supposedly in danger and have asked for help.
Using the language of international intervention like the UN.
Borrowing that kind of framing, yeah. But on a huge scale.
Oh.
The scenario suggests maybe 500,000 Chinese troops rapidly entering, maybe via rail lines they secretly upgraded, leading to what's called a bloodless takeover, because there's no organized Russian state resistance left.
500,000 troops rolling in bloodlessly. Loaded terms, definitely.
The hypothetical continues. PLA quickly takes control, rebuilds ports, manages the resources, and the region gets a new name. Northeast Special Administrative Region, Haishanwei City, using the old Chinese name, Haishanwei, and calling it the restored name, Maritime Dragon City.
Maritime Dragon City. Okay,
Yeah.
That's memorable. And it mentioned Little Red Book influencers, seriously?
Yeah. It adds this weirdly modern, almost satirical touch. Suggests Chinese social media influencers fled the area, posting lifestyle pics, maybe joking like, it's colder than Dali, but more free, implying freedom from Moscow and a cool new frontier.
Wow, geopolitical takeover meets Instagram culture. That's unique. Okay, stage 3, global awkwardness.
Describes the world's reaction in this hypothetical. The U.S. condemns it, but is maybe too focused on domestic issues, too weary to do much.
Strong words, weak actions.
That's the scenario. The EU makes statements about international law, but privately might be relieved Russia is crippled. Japan boosts its own defenses, but also eyes potential trade opportunities with this new Chinese port. Korea is in a tricky spot, but maybe relieved the China-Russia dynamic shifted pressure away.
So a global reaction that's a mix of condemnation, quiet relief, and looking out for number 1. Awkwardness seems like a good word for it.
Paints a picture of pragmatic realism potentially winning out over principle in this specific scenario. Stage 4. CCP propaganda blitz.
Back home in China, what's the story?
Massive propaganda campaign. The century of shame is over. China has truly stood up. Textbooks are immediately rewritten.
Already rewriting history, that's fast.
The analysis describes Chinese netizens celebrating, maybe contrasting it favorably with Taiwan, saying, we attack Tsarist Russia with tanks, not just words. The hypothetical party newspaper headline. Peace isn't begged for, it's taken back.
Peace isn't begged for, it's taken back. Wow, that's quite a slogan for a supposedly peaceful move.
Again, maybe part of the ironic framing in the analysis. Stage 5. Russia collapses.
The final domino falls in this hypothetical.
The Russian Federation completely dissolves, fragments into separate pieces, Siberia independent, Caucasus breaks away, Moscow may be run by warlords or private armies.
So Russia, as we know it, just ceases to exist.
That's the dramatic endpoint of this thought experiment. Putin statues fall. Ukraine reclaims Crimea, maybe expands westward. It even adds a darkly humorous detail about Kazakhs maybe starting to speak Ukrainian, just showing how utterly transformed the map is.
It's a completely different world, mind-boggling to even imagine.
It's a highly specific, extreme outcome based on the thought experiment's premise. The analysis then briefly sketches the resulting world order. China gains land and status, Russia is fragmented, US is tired, EU is conflicted, Japan, Korea adapt, Ukraine is stronger.
So the hypothetical result is China redirects its nationalism, Russia disappears as a major power, replaced by chaos.
A starkly different global setup, yes.
Okay. So we've gone through the current war, the deep history of land transfers, the huge difficulties around Taiwan, and now this absolutely wild hypothetical about attacking a collapsing Russia. What does it all mean? What's the real point the analysis is trying to make with this whole Satan's temptation thing?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Yeah. The analysis suggests the true meaning is layered. First, it's designed to expose what it calls the double standard and selective operation of nationalism.
Double standard? How so?
The argument is, if the CCP's real goal was just about correcting historical injustices, reclaiming lost sovereignty based on Chinese nationalism, then attacking a weakened Russia to get back land lost through those clear unequal treaties should, arguably, be more morally justifiable and strategically easier than invading democratic Taiwan.
Right. If it's truly about righting historical wrongs, why not go after the land Russia took via those treaties, especially if Russia is weak? Why the laser focus on Taiwan instead?
Exactly. The analysis uses this hypothetical to argue that the intense focus on Taiwan, despite the huge risks and difficulties, shows the CCP's motivation isn't primarily about historical sovereignty or simple nationalism in the way they often frame it.
So it's not really about the land or the history in that straightforward sense. What is it about then, according to this analysis?
The core argument boils down to ideology and regime security. Taiwan represents a successful, democratic, Chinese-speaking society right next door.
A living counterexample.
Exactly. Its very existence challenges the CCP's central claim that Chinese people need authoritarian rule for stability and prosperity. Bringing Taiwan under CCP control, one way or another, is seen as essential to validating their own system and securing the regime's long-term survival and legitimacy. Reclaiming land from Russia, while historically resonant and resource-rich, wouldn't solve that fundamental ideological challenge posed by Taiwan's democracy.
So Taiwan is an existential ideological threat to the CCP's right to rule, while the historical Russian land is just valuable land and resources.
That's the key distinction the analysis draws. Taiwan is seen as indispensable for the CCP's narrative and survival. The Russian territories, however valuable, don't address that core political vulnerability. The thought experiment also highlights what it calls the coldness of international realism.
How does it show that?
It suggests that while the world cares deeply, on principle, about Taiwan, its democracy, human rights, its vital economic role, it tends to be much more detached, more pragmatic about historical border disputes or power shifts between big, non-democratic states. Taiwan's democracy itself is presented as a key shield, generating international solidarity and potential intervention that a non-democratic territory, even one with historical claims, might not get.
That's a stark point. Your political system is actually a core part of your defense strategy in the world today.
It's a powerful observation highlighted here. Finally, the analysis suggests the CCP isn't pursuing potentially lower-cost nationalist goals, like hypothetically targeting a collapsing Russia, because those goals don't actually solve the fundamental legitimacy crisis the CCP regime perceives itself to be facing.
So they could theoretically chase other nationalist dreams that might be easier, but they don't.
Not as the top priority. Because, according to this analysis, only the Taiwan issue is seen as addressing that core political and ideological vulnerability that threatens the regime's long-term existence. That makes Taiwan the ultimate prize, however incredibly risky it might be.
Wow. Okay, so this whole wild hypothetical from a collapsed Russia to maritime Dragon City is really just a dramatic way to hammer home the argument that the CCP's focus on Taiwan isn't just about land or history. It's fundamentally about the survival and perceived legitimacy of their entire political system.
That's the core conclusion presented in this material, using an extreme hypothetical scenario to try and illuminate the underlying drivers of geopolitical strategy, suggesting that for the CCP, ideology and regime security trump even potentially easier or more economical nationalist objectives.
What a truly fascinating and maybe unsettling way to look at it all. We have covered a ton of ground today, from the current difficult reality of the Russia-Ukraine war
to that deep dive centuries back into how Russia acquired so much land from China through those unequal treaties.
Then exploring the huge, potentially fatal risks China faces with any attempt to take Taiwan, explaining why it's seen as such an incredibly high-stakes gamble.
And finally, wrapping our heads around this really striking hypothetical, the Satan's temptation idea. that attacking a collapsing Russia might seem more logical strategically, but isn't the priority because Taiwan is tied to something deeper for the CCP ideology and regime survival.
It's definitely a lot to chew on, and it all comes from the information and analysis we've been digging into. It certainly offers a unique, maybe uncomfortable perspective on these incredibly complex global dynamics.
It really does. And navigating this kind of information can feel overwhelming. Our goal, as always, is just to help you cut through it and understand the core arguments being made.
Well, that brings us to the end of this Sip and Talk. Definitely one of the heavier ones we've done, but hopefully we kept it engaging and relatively easy to follow for you.
We certainly gave it our best shot.
Now, before you go, we do have that specific call to action for you today. Ready? Call on you to subscribe to this show, Sip and Talk podcast, and our old friend Micky's YT channel. It's very interesting. Remember to check it out.
Yeah, Micky's channel has some really great stuff, too. Definitely worth a look.
So please do check that out if you get a chance. And thank you, as always, for joining us and sipping along with us through this. We'll catch you next time.
Take care, everyone.